Late afternoon sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Whitmore Logistics, painting long amber streaks across the polished table in the top-floor boardroom. The skyline of Cincinnati stretched beyond the glass. Cranes over the river, the hum of freight trucks far below, a fitting backdrop for the company Teresa Whitmore had built from the ground up. For 2 decades, she and her husband Robert had turned a small regional transport firm into one of the Midwest's most trusted logistics networks. And today was supposed to be another milestone. Teresa adjusted the cuffs of her navy suit and smiled as the translator finished relaying her closing remarks. Across the table, the 2 executives from Yamato Shipping, one of Japan's largest carriers, nodded approvingly. Months of late-night calls, draft proposals, and negotiations had brought them here. A deal that would open the Pacific trade lane for Whitmore Logistics and double their revenue within 3 years. Teresa's pulse quickened with a mix of relief and pride. "We're thrilled about the opportunities ahead," she said, sliding the final contract toward them. One of the executives reached for his pen, and then the door opened. Robert Whitmore stepped inside. His presence immediately shifted the room's temperature. Tall, sharply dressed, exuding the easy authority of a man used to control, he walked toward the head of the table without acknowledging his wife. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, "I appreciate your time today." The Yamato team rose slightly, bowing in greeting. Robert didn't sit. He placed both hands on the table and looked directly at them. "After reviewing the details of this partnership," he continued, his voice measured, "I've decided we will not be moving forward." The words hung in the air, too sharp and sudden to process. Teresa blinked, certain she'd misheard. "Robert," she began carefully, "we finalized the terms together last week." "Everything was approved," he cut her off with a glance so cold it made her throat tighten. "The landscape has changed. This deal no longer aligns with our strategy." The executives exchanged confused looks, whispering quickly in Japanese. One of them cleared his throat. "We thought your company very eager for this cooperation," he said in halting English. "We have already invested significant time." "And we appreciate that," Robert replied, his tone polite but final. "But I've decided it's not the right fit." The silence that followed was suffocating. Teresa felt her heartbeat in her ears. This wasn't just a business decision, it was sabotage. He hadn't consulted her, hadn't even hinted at this reversal. And by doing it here in front of their partners, he had undermined not only the deal, but her credibility as co-founder. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, "with all due respect, this is a decision the board should discuss. You can't. I just did." He didn't raise his voice, but the edge in it was unmistakable. The meeting dissolved quickly after that. The Yamato team gathered their papers with polite but tight smiles, murmuring about needing to reconsider future cooperation. One of them avoided Teresa's eyes as he bowed and followed the other out. The door closed behind them with a soft click that felt deafening. The room was empty except for her and Robert. For a long time, neither spoke. Teresa stared at the untouched contract still lying on the table, the ink not yet dry, the future she had envisioned dissolving like mist. Finally, she lifted her eyes to him. "Why?" Her voice was low but steady. "Do you have any idea what this means for us?" Robert adjusted his cufflinks, unbothered. "It means I'm steering this company in the direction I want. And it means you need to remember your place." "My place?" she echoed, disbelief breaking through the numbness. "I built this company with you." "And I appreciate your contributions," he said smoothly, as if speaking to a vendor, not his wife. Then, colder, "But it's not your place to make these calls anymore." The words landed like a slap. Teresa stood there, trying to absorb them, feeling the humiliation burn beneath her skin. Not just the humiliation of a business partner being cut out of a deal, but of a wife dismissed as if she were an inconvenience. She gathered her papers silently, her hands trembling despite her efforts to control them. Outside, Employees glanced up from their desks as she walked down the hallway. Some looked away quickly. Others offered hesitant smiles that vanished when Robert stepped out of the boardroom behind her. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, in the elevator's mirrored wall. Her reflection looked unfamiliar, a woman blindsided in the very space she had helped create. By the time she reached the parking garage, the late autumn sun had dipped low, bathing the city in copper light. Teresa slid into the driver's seat of her car, gripping the steering wheel as the first pang of anger pierced through the shock. He had humiliated her, deliberately, publicly, and whatever was happening, it was bigger than one ruined deal. As the engine hummed to life, she pulled out into the evening traffic. Streetlights blinked awake above the roads, their glow stretching across the windshield like thin veins of gold. Ahead, the city buzzed with the ordinary rhythm of people heading home. But for Teresa Whitmore, nothing was ordinary anymore. The balance of her life, her marriage, her career, everything she'd built, had shifted in a single, calculated moment. And as the skyline of Cincinnati blurred past her windows, she knew the night ahead would not be just another evening. It would be a reckoning. The sun had long dipped behind the maple-lined streets of Hyde Park by the time Teresa turned into the quiet cul-de-sac where she and Robert had lived for nearly 2 decades. The house, a stately brick colonial with white shutters and a wide porch swing, glowed warmly against the early autumn darkness. It looked unchanged, steady, inviting, safe. But as she parked in the driveway, an unease she couldn't name settled in her chest. Inside, the house was unnervingly still. Only a single lamp burned in the dining room, its light pooling softly across the table where Robert sat, a half-empty glass of bourbon beside him. He didn't look up when she closed the door or when her heels clicked against the hardwood floor. For a moment, Teresa simply watched him, trying to reconcile this cold, distant figure with the man she'd built a life and a company with. "We need to talk about what happened today," she said finally, setting her bag on a chair. "Do you have any idea what you just did? That deal took months to. I know exactly what I did." His voice was calm, too calm. He lifted the glass to his lips, swallowed, and set it back down with a soft clink. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, with an expression that was strangely empty. "I'm done pretending, Teresa. I'm leaving you." The room tilted. For a second, she wasn't sure she'd heard him correctly. What are you talking about?" "I've met someone else," he said flatly. "I've been living with her for a while now." Teresa stared at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Living with her?" He nodded, as if confirming a business decision. "Her name is Claire Bennett. She's 28, and she's pregnant." The words landed one by one, heavy as stones. Teresa took a step back, her hand finding the edge of a chair for balance. "Pregnant?" "She's carrying my son," Robert said, his tone suddenly hardening. "Something you could never give me." The silence that followed was suffocating. Teresa's breath caught in her throat. 20 years of marriage, of shared dreams, sacrifices, nights spent building a company from scratch, reduced in an instant to a sentence designed to wound. "That's not fair," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay composed. "You know what the doctor said. We tried, and it wasn't enough." He pushed his chair back and stood, pacing slowly around the room. "I want a legacy, Teresa. A real one. A son to carry my name. Claire can give me that. You can't." She watched him move across the room with the ease of a man who had already detached himself from the life he was dismantling. "So what happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now," he said, turning to face her, "you pack your things and leave. Claire will be moving in tomorrow." The words sliced through her like glass. "Tomorrow?" "Yes. I've given this a lot of thought." He folded his arms. "You'll get a generous settlement, but you can't stay here. This house will be our family's home." "Our family," she repeated, a bitter laugh catching in her throat. "Robert, this is my home too. I've lived here as long as you have. Not anymore. His voice carried an almost bureaucratic detachment, as though he were discussing a quarterly report instead of the wreckage of a marriage. And the company, she asked, the words tasting like iron. What happens to Whitmore Logistics? He hesitated only a fraction of a second before answering. You're out. I've already filed the papers. Her breath caught. You what? You're not fit to lead, he said simply. I've taken the necessary steps to remove you from the board. It's done. Teresa stared at him, trying to find the man she once loved in the stranger standing before her. The man who used to kiss her forehead before every board meeting, who promised they were building something together, a life, a future, a legacy of their own. But there was nothing left of that man now, only a cold, calculating version who had already erased her from his plans. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, its sound impossibly loud in the silence stretching between them. Teresa had turned away and walked slowly into the kitchen, her legs trembling. She sank into a chair at the small table where they'd once shared morning coffee and late-night laughter, staring at the faint rings left by long-forgotten mugs. The house felt foreign, too quiet, too clean, too hollow. Somewhere upstairs, the radiator hissed to life, filling the silence with a soft, steady breath. She sat there for a long time, motionless, listening to the clock's relentless ticking. Robert's footsteps creaked across the floor above her, drawers opening and closing, the sounds of a man rearranging his life without her. And still she did not cry. Teresa had always believed that tears were a luxury reserved for people who still had hope. Tonight, she felt none, only the cold, heavy weight of something ending. She folded her hands on the table and stared into the darkened hallway, the ticking clock marking the seconds of a marriage's last night. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the shock and the humiliation, something quiet began to stir. A resolve. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, only that she would not crumble. Not for him. Not for anyone. The house was quiet by the time the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight. Outside, a thin veil of moonlight slipped through the clouds and filtered in through the kitchen window, spilling pale silver across the hardwood floors. It was the kind of stillness Teresa had once cherished, the peace of a shared home settling into sleep. But tonight, the silence felt different. It was the silence of something that had already ended. Teresa moved through the rooms without turning on the lights, her bare feet making no sound against the floor. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the stew she had cooked earlier, a meal Robert hadn't bothered to eat. His untouched plate still sat on the counter, next to the glass of bourbon he had abandoned. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, yet none of it felt familiar. She paused by the doorway of the living room, her eyes drifting over the photographs lining the mantel. Their wedding day, the company's first office ribbon cutting, vacations by the coast, holidays with friends. 2 decades of a life built together stared back at her, frozen in frames that now felt like artifacts from a story that wasn't hers anymore. Teresa took a slow breath and turned toward the study. The heavy oak door creaked softly as she pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and cedar polish. She knelt by the built-in cabinet and twisted the combination on the safe she had insisted they install years ago. When the lock clicked open, she pulled the door wide and began removing everything that mattered. Property deeds, stock certificates, partnership agreements, original contracts signed with early investors. All of it was still legally hers for now. She slipped the documents into a leather briefcase one by one, methodically, almost ritualistically. There were no tears now, no trembling hands. The storm had passed hours ago in the dining room. What remained was something quieter, not numbness but clarity. On the desk sat her laptop, its screen casting a faint blue glow. Teresa opened the folders that held the company's financial records and quietly copied key files onto an external drive. Spreadsheets, emails, board meeting notes. Anything that could later prove her role, her ownership, her right to what she had built. When she finished, she tucked the drive into the briefcase beside the documents. Her gaze swept over the study one last time. The leather chair in the corner where Robert used to read trade journals late into the night. The dent in the edge of the desk where she had once slammed her coffee mug in frustration after losing their first major client. The photograph of the two of them at the company's 10-year anniversary gala, smiling like people who believed in forever. She exhaled slowly. Forever had lasted exactly 19 years and 7 months. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked faintly, Robert turning over in his sleep. Teresa hesitated, her eyes drifting toward the staircase. She climbed the steps quietly, careful to avoid the one that always groaned. The hallway was dim, lit only by a sliver of moonlight leaking in through the window at the end. She pushed open the door to the master bedroom. Robert was asleep, one arm flung across the empty side of the bed. His breathing was deep and steady, the untroubled sleep of a man who had detonated a life and felt no remorse. For a long moment, she stood there watching him. Memories flickered unbidden. The way he had once waited up for her after long nights at the office. The way he had kissed her forehead before every investor meeting. The way they had whispered plans for the future into the dark. All of it gone. All of it replaced by betrayal delivered with surgical precision. Teresa stepped closer, stopping just shy of the bed. The moonlight grazed his face, softening the hard lines she had barely noticed forming over the years. He looked younger in sleep, almost like the man she had once fallen in love with. But she knew better now. That man no longer existed. "He discarded me like I was nothing," she whispered in the quiet, the words barely audible even to herself. "But he'll remember my name." She turned and walked away, back in the guest room. She opened the closet and pulled down a small suitcase. She packed slowly, deliberately, a few changes of clothes, her passport, the worn leather notebook where she'd scribbled ideas for the company back when it was just a dream. She tucked the briefcase full of documents inside and zipped it shut. Then she picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed. "Ellen," she said softly when the line clicked. "I'm sorry to call this late. I need a place to stay for a few days." Ellen had been a friend for years, a fellow member of the Women in Business Alliance, someone who understood discretion. "Of course," came the sleepy reply. "Come whenever you need." "Thank you," Teresa whispered. She ended the call, slipped the phone into her bag, and took one last look around the room. It was just a guest room, but it had once held visiting family, holiday laughter, the comforting chaos of a life shared. Now it was a stop on her way out. Downstairs, the night air drifted in through a cracked window, cool and clean. She paused by the front door, glancing back at the house, the kitchen where they'd planned their future, the stairs they'd climbed together after countless late nights, the study where they'd dreamed up an empire. Every corner carried a memory, but none of it belonged to her anymore. Not really. She stepped outside, closing the door softly behind her. The street was silent, the trees whispering in the autumn breeze. As she walked toward her car, the moonlight followed, silvering the path ahead. Teresa didn't know exactly what she would do next, but one thing was certain. She would not disappear quietly. The next morning dawned crisp and cool, the kind of early autumn morning Cincinnati did so well. Skies washed pale blue, a thin veil of mist curling off the Ohio River. Teresa drove downtown with the heater humming softly, a travel mug of coffee in the cup holder, and the leather briefcase from last night resting on the seat beside her. Her hands were steady on the wheel. She had slept little, but her mind was unervingly clear. Whatever Robert thought, she still owned half of Whitmore Logistics. She still had responsibilities, decisions to make, a company to run, and she was not going to vanish quietly from the life she had helped build. The parking garage beneath the company's headquarters was half empty when she pulled in. A few employees were arriving, clutching paper bags of breakfast sandwiches and coffee cups as they hurried toward the elevators. Teresa adjusted her blazer, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the chill morning air. The lobby doors swung open automatically as she approached. She expected the familiar hum, the polished marble floors, the scent of espresso drifting from the first-floor cafe, the muted conversations of staff starting their day. Instead, everything felt off. The receptionist behind the front desk stiffened when she saw Teresa walk in. A pair of junior analysts, chatting near the elevators, fell silent mid-sentence. The shift in the air was subtle but unmistakable. Something had changed. She headed for the elevator bank anyway. She had nearly reached the doors when a figure stepped into her path. "Morning, Ms. Whitmore," said Kevin Miles, the building's head of security. He looked uneasy, one hand hovering near the badge clipped to his belt. "Morning, Kevin," she said briskly. "I'm heading upstairs. Could you press for me? My hands are full." He didn't move. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't let you up." Teresa frowned. "What do you mean you can't let me up? I work here." "I know," he said, shifting awkwardly, "but Mr. Whitmore left strict instructions this morning. He said you're no longer authorized to access the building." For a second, she thought she'd misheard him. "Kevin," she said slowly, "I'm a co-founder. I have an office on the 23rd floor. My name is on the company registration. You know this." "I do," he said gently, "but I have my orders." He gestured toward the security desk. "They've already deactivated your keycard." A cold wave rolled through her chest. She dug through her purse anyway, pulling out the card and pressing it against the reader beside the elevator. The light blinked red. "Access denied." "This is ridiculous," she muttered, trying again. Red. Again. Kevin's voice was soft. "I really am sorry, Ms. Whitmore. If it were up to me—" "It's not," she cut in, her voice tight. "I understand." She stood there for a long moment, the weight of the scene pressing down on her. Employees hurried past, some offering apologetic glances, others pretending not to notice. Her face burned with humiliation, but she lifted her chin and turned back toward the lobby doors. Outside, the city was coming to life, buses rumbling past, coffee shops filling, traffic thickening at the lights. Teresa walked down the block until she reached a small cafe across the street from the building. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered. She ordered a black coffee she'd barely tasted and slid into a corner booth with a clear view of Whitmore Logistics' glass facade. From here, she could see the steady stream of employees swiping their badges, disappearing into the place she had helped build from nothing. She opened her laptop, ready to send a message to the accounting department, only to be met with a login error. She tried again, and again. Finally, a line of text appeared across the screen. "Access denied. Account deactivated." Her heart thudded. She tried her company email. Same message. Even the shared server, where years of contracts and internal communications were stored, rejected her credentials. It was as if she had never existed. Teresa stared at the error message, her jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Then, with deliberate calm, she picked up her phone and dialed Robert's number. He answered on the second ring. "What do you want?" "What do I want?" she echoed, the words trembling with restrained fury. "I want to know why my keycard doesn't work, why my email is locked, why I'm standing outside the company I built." His reply was short and unbothered. "Because you're not part of this company anymore." "Not part of, Robert. You can't just erase me. Half of everything in that building is mine." "Was," he corrected smoothly. "You should have read the documents you signed more carefully. Goodbye, Teresa." The line went dead. Teresa lowered the phone slowly, her breath shallow. Around her, the cafe buzzed with the soft clatter of cups and quiet morning chatter. But all she could hear was the blood rushing in her ears. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was planned, calculated. The deal, sabotage, the ultimatum, the eviction. It had all been part of something bigger. Robert had been preparing this for weeks, maybe months. He hadn't just left her. He was erasing her. Teresa sat back against the booth, her eyes drifting toward the leather briefcase resting beside her. She reached for it, unlatched the clasp, and opened it just enough to see the neat stacks of documents inside. Property deeds, partnership agreements, original contracts with her signature clearly visible. The very foundation of everything they had built together. Last night, she had grabbed them on instinct, a lifeline in the dark. Now, as the reality of her situation settled in, she saw them for what they truly were. They weren't relics of a life she'd lost. They were leverage, evidence, power. Teresa closed the briefcase and set it carefully on the seat beside her. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, reflecting off the glass facade of Whitmore Logistics until it gleamed like a fortress. Robert thought he had locked her out for good. He thought she would disappear quietly, humiliated and defeated. But as Teresa stared at the building across the street, something cold and steady settled inside her. He might control the locks. He might even control the narrative. But she had the keys that mattered. And she was far from done. 2 days later, a steady rain swept across Cincinnati, softening the city's sharp edges into a blur of silver and slate. Teresa tightened her coat against the chill as she stepped out of the cab and into the glass-fronted lobby of Hayes and Carter LLP, one of the city's most respected law firms. She had barely slept since the morning Robert locked her out of her own company. Every hour since had been consumed by calls, research, and long, silent stretches, staring at the stack of documents she had taken from the safe. Today, that stack sat neatly in the leather briefcase in her hand, the last tangible proof that she still existed in the world Robert was trying to erase her from. The receptionist greeted her politely and led her down a quiet hallway lined with framed verdicts and certificates. At the end of it, a door stood slightly ajar. "Ms. Whitmore," a warm voice called from inside. "Please come in." Daniel Hayes rose from behind a dark walnut desk as she entered, tall and composed, with the deliberate calm of someone who had spent his life navigating chaos for others. He shook her hand firmly and gestured toward a chair. "I've read through the basics of what you sent over," he said, sitting opposite her. "But I'd like to hear it directly from you. Start wherever you need to." Teresa drew a slow breath and began. She told him everything: the boardroom ambush, the confession at home, the eviction, the locked doors, the dead phone calls. She described the deactivated email accounts, the missing access to company servers, the sudden disappearance of her name from every internal document. And finally, she placed the papers from the briefcase on the desk. Incorporation documents bearing her signature, partnership agreements, property titles. "I was there from the beginning," she said quietly. "That company exists because I built it. And now he's trying to erase me as if I never mattered." Daniel flipped through the documents carefully, his eyes scanning the pages with the practiced precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. When he spoke, his tone was steady but serious. "These are strong, very strong. If your name is on these and you never signed anything transferring ownership, then Robert has a serious problem." He set one document aside and looked up at her. "You said he presented a transfer agreement in court." Teresa nodded. "He claims I sold my shares to a third party. I've never seen that document before in my life." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing. "If he forged your signature, that's criminal. Plain and simple. It's not just a civil matter, that's fraud, and the courts take that very seriously. But we'll need to prove it." "How?" "Forensic handwriting analysis," he replied without hesitation. "We'll have an expert examine the signature and compare it to verified samples from the documents you've provided. If they determine it's forged, the judge will see right through whatever game he's playing." He paused, studying her carefully. "It won't be quick and it won't be easy. People like your husband, they fight dirty. Are you ready for that?" Teresa met his gaze. "He underestimated me. That's the only mistake I need him to make." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Daniel's mouth. Good. Then let's get to work. They spent the next hour going over the details, potential witnesses, timelines, financial records that could support her claim. Daniel asked sharp, precise questions, and Teresa answered them with the same quiet focus that had once made her a force in the boardroom. Not once did her voice waver. When they finished, Daniel closed the folder and leaned forward. There's something else we should talk about, he said. I don't want to alarm you, but it's not uncommon in cases like this for the other party to try to intimidate or surveil you. You said he knew where you were staying. I've been at a friend's apartment since I left, she admitted. He doesn't know the address. I think. Daniel nodded. Let's keep it that way. We have a company apartment a few blocks from here. Quiet, secure, and off the radar. It's used for witnesses or clients in sensitive cases. I'd feel better if you stayed there until the initial filings are done. Teresa hesitated. The idea of leaving even the little that remained of her old life unsettled her. But the memory of Robert's voice on the phone, "You're not part of this company anymore," hardened her resolve. All right, she said finally. I'll take it. Good. Daniel slid a business card across the table. Here's my personal number. Call me if anything happens, anything. We'll file the first motion by next week. Teresa picked up the card and tucked it into her wallet. As she stood to leave, Daniel rose with her. I have to say, he remarked, a note of quiet respect in his voice, I've seen a lot of clients break down by this point. Most people would be furious or shattered, but you're remarkably composed. Teresa gave a small, almost wistful smile. I did my crying a long time ago, she said softly. Now I'm just getting ready. Outside, the rain had grown heavier, drumming steadily against the office windows. Teresa walked over to the glass wall that overlooked the city. Downtown Cincinnati stretched beneath her, streets glistening under the rain, headlights streaking like pale ribbons through the mist. Somewhere out there, Robert was going about his day, certain he had already won. She rested her palm against the cool glass and exhaled. The ache in her chest was still there, the betrayal, the humiliation. But beneath it, something harder was taking shape. She was not powerless, not yet. And for the first time since that night, Teresa felt the faint stirrings of something that almost resembled hope. She turned back toward the door, the leather briefcase heavy in her hand, and stepped out into the rain. A week later, the rain had given way to a brittle autumn chill that clung to the air like a warning. Teresa stood on the sidewalk outside the red brick colonial she had once called home, a house whose windows now glowed warmly with someone else's life. A for sale sign still hadn't appeared on the lawn. Of course it hadn't. Robert hadn't wasted any time moving his new reality into the space they had built together. She drew in a slow breath and walked up the familiar front steps. The porch still creaked in the same spot. The wreath on the door, the one she had chosen last Thanksgiving, was gone, replaced by something newer, brighter, impersonal. Teresa rang the bell. A moment later, the door swung open. Claire Bennett stood there, framed in the doorway, every inch of her posture radiating confidence. She was younger than Teresa by nearly 20 years, tall and slim, with an effortless kind of beauty that came from knowing the world bent for you. A faint smirk tugged at her lips as she leaned casually against the doorframe. Well, Claire said, her tone sugar-coated and sharp all at once, if it isn't the former Mrs. Whitmore. Teresa's expression didn't change. I came to pick up a few personal items. That's all. Of course, Claire replied smoothly, stepping aside. Though I should warn you, this is our home now. The word "our" landed like a stone, but Teresa didn't flinch. She walked past Claire into the foyer, the scent of unfamiliar perfume hanging in the air where once there had been cinnamon candles and cedar polish. Everything looked the same, yet utterly different. The console table still stood against the wall, but the family photos had been replaced by new frames. Pictures of Robert and Claire smiling on a patio somewhere, Claire in a flowing sundress, Robert's arm possessively around her waist. A framed ultrasound image sat prominently at the center. Teresa stared at it for a moment longer than she meant to. "Cute, isn't it?" Claire said behind her. "He insisted we put it there. He's so excited about his son." Son. The word twisted in Teresa's stomach. She swallowed it down and kept walking, heading for the study where she'd left a few books and a small wooden box of keepsakes. But Claire followed her, unwilling to let the silence stretch too far. "You know," she began casually, "he told me how long he waited for this. How much he wanted a family that actually felt like one. It's sad, really, how much time he wasted." Teresa paused, her hand resting on the doorknob. "He wasted nothing," she said evenly. "He built a company, a life, one you now enjoy. That wasn't nothing." Claire's smile sharpened. "And now he has everything he ever wanted. A real alma, a real family." She placed a hand gently on her still round belly, cradling it as though to underline the point. 8 months along now. Can you believe it? The number caught Teresa's attention immediately. 8 months. She ran the math in her head automatically. 8 months ago, Robert was still sleeping beside her every night. 8 months ago, they were still making plans for the company's expansion. 8 months ago, Claire wasn't supposed to exist. A small, cold seed of suspicion lodged itself in Teresa's chest. She turned, studying Claire more closely now, the overconfident tilt of her chin, the way she seemed almost too eager to emphasize the timeline. 8 months, Teresa repeated softly as if to herself. Claire mistook her tone for defeat. "Yes," she said brightly. "Not long now until everything is exactly as it should be." "Maybe," Teresa murmured, her voice so calm it almost didn't sound like her own. "But time has a way of telling the truth." Claire's smile faltered for the briefest second before returning, tighter this time. "I suppose it does." Teresa didn't give her the satisfaction of a further response. She turned back to the task at hand, collecting the few things she had come for: a stack of business journals, a framed photograph of her late father, the small box of keepsakes from her early days with the company. Nothing more. As she walked back toward the door, she felt Claire's eyes on her the entire way, heavy with triumph. "You don't have to worry," Claire called after her lightly. "We'll take good care of the place." Teresa paused by the threshold, but didn't turn around. "I'm sure you will," she said. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted, casting long golden lines across the quiet street. Teresa started down the front steps, her bag heavier than it should have been with so few things inside. And then she stopped. Through the living room window, she saw Robert. He was standing near the couch, gently swaying back and forth with a baby in his arms, a tiny bundle wrapped in a pale blue blanket. The sight hit her harder than she expected. He looked different, softer, almost tender. For a long moment, she watched in silence. Then her gaze drifted from Robert's face to the child's, and the cold little seed inside her chest pressed deeper. 8 months, she thought again. But that baby wasn't due next month. That baby was already here. She turned and walked back to her car, her expression unreadable, the October wind tugging gently at her hair. Behind her, laughter echoed faintly through the open window. Claire's high, bright laugh mixing with Robert's deeper voice. It no longer sounded like home. Teresa gripped the steering wheel as she slid into the driver's seat, her eyes fixed on the road ahead but her mind turning over and over the same thought. Robert believed he had rewritten the story. He believed everything was settled. But time had a way of telling the truth. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the ache and the anger, suspicion began to take root, a small, sharp seed that would not stop growing. 2 months later, a biting winter wind swept across downtown Cincinnati as Teresa stepped out of a cab and stared up at the pale stone facade of the Hamilton County Courthouse. It loomed against the gray December sky, its carved columns stark and imposing, a fitting stage for what lay ahead. She drew her coat tighter around her and followed Daniel Hayes up the granite steps, the weight of the past months pressing heavy on her shoulders. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a reckoning for everything Robert had tried to take from her. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with quiet tension. Attorneys shuffled papers, bailiffs called out case numbers, and the low hum of conversations echoed off the high ceilings. Teresa sat at the plaintiff's table beside Daniel, her briefcase neatly tucked under the chair, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Across the aisle, Robert arrived moments later with his attorney, a sharp-faced man in a tailored charcoal suit. Robert himself looked every bit the picture of confidence, striding into the courtroom in a navy overcoat and silk tie, nodding curtly to those who greeted him. He glanced at Teresa briefly as he passed, his lips curling into a faint smirk. He thinks he's already won, she thought. The bailiff called the session to order, and the room settled into silence. Judge Whitaker, a seasoned figure with silver hair and a reputation for patience that bordered on legendary, took the bench. "This is Whitmore versus Whitmore," the clerk announced. "Civil case 24 to 1157, concerning ownership and transfer of shares in Whitmore Logistics, LLC." The judge's gaze swept over both parties. "Counselors, are we ready to proceed?" Robert's attorney rose first. "Yes, Your Honor. My client will be presenting evidence today that Ms. Whitmore voluntarily signed a transfer agreement relinquishing her shares in Whitmore Logistics to a third party. We will argue that her claims of ownership are without merit." Daniel stood. "Your Honor, the plaintiff contests the authenticity of the document in question. We believe the signature was forged, and we are prepared to submit expert testimony and verified exemplars for comparison." Judge Whitaker nodded. "Very well. Let's proceed." Robert's lawyer called their first witness, a notary public who testified that she had been present when the transfer agreement was allegedly signed. Teresa listened intently as the woman described the signing, her story rehearsed and polished. But small inconsistencies surfaced. The date she mentioned did not align with Teresa's known whereabouts, and the office address listed was one that had been closed at the time. Then, with a theatrical flourish, Robert's lawyer presented the document itself. "As you can see, Your Honor, this is Ms. Whitmore's signature, notarized and dated March 14th of this year." He slid the paper toward the bench. Teresa's heart clenched as she looked at the looping scrawl beside her typed name. It was a near-perfect imitation, close enough that most eyes would never question it. Most eyes, but not all. Daniel rose, smoothly. "Your Honor, we dispute the validity of this signature. We request that the document be submitted for forensic analysis and compared to authenticated samples of Ms. Whitmore's handwriting." The judge considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Request granted. This court will recess pending completion of the handwriting analysis. Once results are available, we will reconvene." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Robert leaned back in his chair, his expression unbothered. When the judge adjourned the session and the bailiff called the room to order, he rose slowly and crossed the aisle toward Teresa. "Still clinging to the past, aren't you?" he murmured, his voice low enough that only she and Daniel could hear. "You should have taken the settlement and disappeared. This fight is beneath you." Teresa met his gaze without a word. He stepped closer, his smirk widening. "You couldn't even give me a son, Teresa. What makes you think you can win this?" Daniel shifted beside her, his jaw tightening, but she placed a steadying hand on his arm before he could speak. She wouldn't give Robert the satisfaction of a reaction. Not here. Not now. Instead, she held his gaze, her expression as cold and steady as the marble columns outside. After a beat, Robert scoffed and turned away, following his attorney toward the exit. The corridor outside the courtroom was crowded with reporters and curious onlookers. Flashes popped as Robert strode past them, answering a few softball questions with the smug ease of a man who believed the story was already written. Teresa and Daniel slipped through a side hallway to avoid the worst of the crowd. They walked in silence until they reached a quieter stretch of the courthouse, where the noise faded and the winter light slanted through tall, arched windows. Daniel stopped and turned to face her. "He's going to push every button you have," he said quietly. "That's his strategy. If he can get under your skin, make you lash out, he wins the narrative." Teresa nodded, her breath misting faintly in the cold air seeping through the window panes. "He wants me angry. He wants me broken." "Exactly," Daniel said. "Don't give him that. Keep your composure, no matter what he says. We'll win this, but only if we play the long game." She looked out the window, watching the snow begin to fall in soft, slow flakes, blurring the city streets below. Somewhere out there, Robert was celebrating what he thought was an inevitable victory. But Teresa knew better. The handwriting analysis would come back. The truth would surface. And when it did, the empire he thought he controlled would start to crack. "We'll win," Daniel repeated softly beside her. "Just don't lose your composure." Teresa exhaled slowly and nodded again. She felt the familiar ache in her chest. Betrayal, humiliation, anger. But beneath it, something harder, colder, more enduring had taken root. Robert thought this was the end of her story, but it was only the beginning. And she would make sure that when the truth emerged, it would not just vindicate her. It would destroy the illusion of control he had built his world upon. A week later, the cold had sharpened along the Ohio River, the water rippling dark and restless under a slate-colored sky. Teresa sat in the corner of a quiet cafe overlooking the waterfront, a mug of coffee cooling untouched in front of her. Outside, joggers pass along the riverwalk, bundled against the chill, their laughter and footsteps distant against the steady hush of the wind. Daniel arrived a few minutes late, shaking the cold from his coat as he slipped into the seat across from her. He placed a thick manila envelope on the table, the corners slightly worn from handling. "It's official," he said, his voice low. "The handwriting analysis came back this morning." Teresa's heart gave a small, steady thud. "And—" "It's forged," Daniel said. "No question." The analyst was unequivocal. "The signature on the transfer agreement isn't yours. The pressure points, the slant, the pen flow, it's all inconsistent with your authenticated signatures. Whoever did this tried to be clever, but they made mistakes." Relief washed through her, like a breath she'd been holding for months. Still, she didn't smile. "So the court will accept it." "It will be admissible as evidence," Daniel nodded, "and it will blow a massive hole in Robert's defense. But don't expect him to back down. Men, like him, don't surrender. They double down." He was right. Robert hadn't slowed his attacks. If anything, they had escalated. Over the past week, rumors had begun to swirl, whispered in boardrooms, repeated in trade publications, trickling into conversations among their mutual acquaintances. Robert hadn't just questioned Teresa's competence. He had gone after her dignity. "He's telling people I had an abortion," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her untouched coffee. "That I did it without telling him and that it left me unable to have children." Daniel's expression hardened. "That's slander." "It's effective," she replied bitterly. "People believe it. They look at me differently now, like I'm broken, untrustworthy, like I ruined everything." She took a slow breath, her eyes distant. "It's cruel, but it's clever. He knows how much this hurts." Daniel leaned forward, his tone measured. "We can fight that." "A defamation suit." "No," she interrupted softly. "Not yet." She looked up at him then, and for the first time in weeks, there was something fierce behind her calm. "There's something I never told anyone. Not the board. Not even my closest friends." "What is it?" "The reason we never had children," she said, her voice steady but quiet, "was never me." Daniel blinked. "What do you mean?" "We both got tested," she continued. "More than once. Years ago, when we first started trying. And every doctor told us the same thing. He was the one who couldn't have children. It wasn't my body that failed. It was his." Daniel stared at her, stunned. "Are you saying—" "I kept it secret," she said, cutting him off gently. "I wanted to protect him. I didn't want the board or our families or anyone else to see him as less than he wanted to be. He begged me not to tell anyone, and I agreed. I thought marriage was about protecting each other." Her lips curved into a small, bitter smile. "But he spent the past months telling the world I was the one who failed him." Daniel was silent for a long moment. "Teresa," he said carefully, "if what you're telling me is documented, it changes everything. If he's the infertile party, and he's claiming this child as his, then it opens questions he doesn't want asked," she finished for him. "About paternity, about honesty, about everything." The cold little seed that had taken root the day Claire mentioned, 8 months, now bloomed into something darker, sharper. The timeline, the pregnancy, the baby she'd seen in Robert's arms. None of it added up. And Robert had gone to extraordinary lengths to destroy her credibility before anyone could start asking why. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "This is significant, but it's also dangerous. Once this comes out, there's no putting it back. Are you sure you want to use it?" Teresa nodded once. "He wanted to destroy me with lies," she said quietly, every word deliberate. "I'll end him with truth." The cafe around them had grown busier, but Teresa barely noticed. A group of students laughed loudly by the window. A barista called out a name for a latte. Life moved on, ordinary and unbothered, while something seismic shifted in the quiet space between her and Daniel. "We'll need documentation," he said finally. "Medical records, test results, anything official that proves what you're saying. And we'll need to handle it carefully. The moment we reveal this, the case won't just be about forged signatures. It'll be about everything." Teresa reached into her briefcase and pulled out a slim folder, worn at the edges. She had kept it buried in the back of a filing cabinet for years, telling herself she would never use it. But that was before Robert tried to erase her, before he spat on 2 decades of loyalty, before he built his new life on a foundation of lies. She slid the folder across the table. Daniel opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the pages. After a few moments, he closed it again, his face unreadable. "This will do," he said quietly. "It's more than enough." Teresa nodded. The decision had been made. There would be no going back now. Outside, the river flowed steadily under the pale winter sky, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding along its banks. Teresa watched it for a long time, her reflection faintly visible in the cafe window, eyes calm, shoulders squared, the faintest flicker of something fierce in her expression. Back at the table, Daniel carefully placed the folder into a large manila envelope and sealed it shut. The sound of the flap pressing closed was quiet but final, like the click of a lock. "We're ready," he said softly. Teresa stared at the envelope, its weight heavier than paper alone. Inside, it lay the truth that could end Robert's empire, his lies, and the carefully constructed illusion of the life he had built without her. The cafe grew quieter as the afternoon light faded, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Only the soft hum of conversation and the distant rush of the river filled the silence, a silence heavy with everything that was about to change. The morning was bright and unseasonably warm, the kind of soft, golden day that made Cincinnati's riverside parks glow like watercolor. Teresa walked along the winding path of Eden Park, the leather envelope tucked beneath her arm. The trees that lined the walkway were nearly bare now, their last few leaves spinning lazily to the ground in the breeze. Ahead, on a familiar bench overlooking the Ohio River, Robert was waiting. She remembered the first time they had sat there, decades ago, not long after their wedding. Young, hopeful, still believing that forever was something you could build with sheer determination. Now, forever was gone, and all that remained was this. He didn't bother to stand when she approached. "You wanted to see me," he said flatly, his hands resting on his knees. "Make it quick. I have a meeting in an hour." Teresa didn't answer. She simply extended the envelope toward him. "You'll want to read this." Robert eyed it with suspicion, then tore it open. A small stack of papers slid into his lap. Lab reports, test results, notarized copies of records from the fertility clinic they had visited years ago. He glanced over them with an amused smirk at first, clearly expecting some desperate, last-ditch attempt to sway him. But as his eyes scanned line after line, the smirk began to falter. His brow furrowed, his lips parted. He flipped to the next page, then the next, his hands growing unsteady. "This," he stammered, the color draining from his face. "This can't be true." "It is," Teresa said calmly. "Every doctor we saw said the same thing. The reason we never had children wasn't me, Robert. It was you. You're infertile. You always have been." For a long, stunned moment, he said nothing. The only sound was the river below, lapping softly against the stone embankment. Then he laughed, sharp, disbelieving, almost desperate. "You're lying. You fabricated this." "I didn't," she replied. "And deep down, you know I didn't. You were there when we got the results. You begged me never to tell anyone. I kept that promise until now." Robert's hands clenched around the papers, crumpling the edges. "Then what are you implying?" Teresa met his gaze with a quiet steadiness that unnerved him. "I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you, that child isn't yours." The words struck like a hammer blow. Robert stared at her, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No. Claire wouldn't. Time has a way of telling the truth," Teresa said softly, echoing the words she had spoken in that very house a week earlier. "You built a new life on a lie, Robert. Maybe it's time you asked yourself whose lie it really is." She turned to leave, but paused long enough to look back at him one last time. Justice doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it just arrives. And then she walked away, her footsteps steady against the gravel path, the wind tugging gently at her coat. Robert sat frozen on the bench, the papers trembling in his hands, the world tilting beneath him. A flock of birds scattered overhead, their cries sharp and distant, but he barely heard them. All he could hear was the echo of Teresa's voice. "That child isn't yours." He left the park without thinking, driving home faster than he ever had before, the steering wheel slick in his sweating hands. Claire was in the kitchen when he burst through the door, humming softly as she prepared a bottle. She looked up, startled by the way he slammed the envelope down on the counter. "What's this?" she asked, her voice cautious. "You tell me," he snapped. "Explain it." She frowned and picked up the papers, her eyes darting over the text, her face drained of color as she realized what they were. "Robert, answer me," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Is it true? Am I infertile?" It's complicated," she stammered, backing away a step. "It's not what you think." "Then say it." His voice was raw now, desperation and fury tangled together. Claire's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. "I never planned for this. I thought you'd never find out." "Whose child is it?" he demanded. Silence. Her lips trembled, but no words came. That silence was louder than any confession. Robert's breath came in ragged bursts. He stumbled back, his vision tunneling, the edges of the room swimming in cold, nauseating clarity. All the boasts, all the cruel things he had said to Teresa, "You couldn't give me a son," came crashing back now, each one cutting deeper than the last. Upstairs, the baby began to cry. Claire turned toward the sound, her hands shaking, but Robert didn't move. He couldn't. He sank onto the couch, the weight of it all pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. The morning light filtered weakly through the curtains, casting long, cold beams across the living room. They fell across his face, hollow and ashen, his eyes empty as he stared at nothing. Outside, across the street, Teresa stood beside her car, watching from a distance. Through the front window, she could see him, shoulders slumped, head bowed, the papers lying limp at his feet. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply watched in silence, the wind carrying the faint scent of river water and fallen leaves through the air. "Justice doesn't shout," she murmured, almost to herself. "It just arrives." And with that, she turned away. The city moved on around her, cars passing, leaves swirling, the river flowing steadily toward the horizon. But in that quiet moment, as she walked toward the waiting car, Teresa knew the storm had finally broken. Not with a scream, not with a spectacle, but with the soft, devastating silence of truth. "Fade out,"